네, 안녕하세요. 한국어 좀 서툴러가지고 오늘 영어로 발표를 하겠습니다. So I was asked to present about how do you become a global unicorn. I think unicorns, we're familiar with that word, companies that are valued over $1 billion, and wanted to introduce a little bit about our thoughts on how you founders here in Korea can become a global unicorn, and what we've seen in our portfolio at 500 Global. So just quickly, I want to introduce a little bit about 500. So we are a global venture capital firm based out of Palo Alto, California. We were founded in 2010, and now we manage about $2.7 billion, have invested into 2,600 portfolio companies globally, making up about 5,000 founders who are part of the 500 strong community globally. We've also made investments into startups based in over 80 different countries throughout the world. The map of green marks is where we are active and where we have made investments. And the dots are where we have our staff members, our senior partners, or our junior staff members based physically in these areas throughout the world. We've also been fortunate to have over 45 companies that we've seeded who later became unicorns, and the same companies, about 130 who are over $100 million valuation. We have about 130 of those companies that we call centaurs. So I want to use this as a little bit of a background on the next sort of topic at large, which is talking about unicorns a little bit more. Big thing to know, the reason why there's been so many companies that have recently become unicorns is clearly tied to the funding activity that we've seen in the venture capital space. So globally, over the last 10 years, it has increased 5x, whereas in 2021, we had a total funding of $630 billion in global venture capital. So it's gotten up quite a bit. And here in Korea has also seen a large jump from 2014 to where it is today. So we're seeing this trend globally in terms of what venture capital is doing. So it's not a coincidence that the number of unicorns also have been minted at historic paces over the last 10 years either. So in 2013, when the term unicorn itself was coined, talking about how rare unicorns are, there are only 20 companies that became unicorns in the year that blog post came out and made the term unicorn popular for all of us who know it now. Now we obviously see quite a lot more. Just last year alone, there was 521 new unicorns minted globally as well. So total, there's about a little over 1,100 unicorns who are active in the world today. And they're also now happening and emerging outside of the markets that we're all aware of. So just as an example, more than half of the world's unicorns are no longer from the US. About 57% of unicorns right now are based outside of the US, whereas back in 2013, it was 70% who are US-based unicorns, and then 30% was markets outside, including China, India, so on and so forth. But it's really not about the activity that we see that's limited to China. It's not limited to US. It's not limited to Southeast Asia. As we see here, it's all different parts of the world, including Latin America, Africa, Europe, Middle East, and you obviously have the Southeast Asia, South Asias, and here in Korea as well. So let's talk about, first of all, before we go into the topic of how do you become a global unicorn, let me just give you some figures around what makes a unicorn, right? How do you get to that first billion-dollar valuation as a startup? There's a very, very generic way of looking at this, but just to give you an example, there's really main two ways that a company can raise their first round, value being at $1 billion, and hence the first round that they become minted as unicorns. I think there's hyper growth of revenue at scale. So about $50 million plus in terms of software margin revenues that you're able to get that are growing around 3x a year. That is where you start to get close to becoming a unicorn. So the times are all going to be different. Last year you could have had 30 million and you're a unicorn, right? Now you might need 100 million to be a unicorn. So times are all over the place, but just want you to know that it's hyper growth revenue at scale. So something over $50 million with hyper great margins like software, like 80% margins, and you also need to be growing fast. And if you're not in the business yet of making revenue, then you can also become a unicorn by having a lot of users. So for consumer products, you can have hyper growth users at scale for those consumer products. And that's usually about 50 million monthly active users, maybe as low as 20, but something that's growing fast. And these are very arbitrary numbers. You might need 100 million monthly active users, but it's something that gives you scale that seems like a lot of people are using your product, and then that your product is meant for a lot of people in the world or the market that you're serving in. And an investor needs to sort of believe that your MAU one day will produce a revenue of around $5 to $10 a year from those monthly active users that you have. Hence, you get similar to that $50 million annual revenue target that I have on the hypergrowth on the left column here as well. So I'll just talk through a little bit of stats on just global markets on how long everything takes. So the average, a unicorn took to become a unicorn, it's about 5 to 8 years since founding. The ranges are all over the place. One of our companies in Africa called Chip for Cash, they became a $3 billion company in a matter of 18 months since they graduated from our accelerator. So there's just extraordinary sort of cases like that. But there's also companies that go through 10, 15 years without needing to raise any outside round because they have a healthy growing business. And so it may take them 15 years to get a valuation set by an investor who values them over $1 billion as well. But in the modern day of tech startups, which most of your founders who are presenting here today are, keep in mind it takes usually about 5 to 8 years to become a unicorn. So really, on this topic, you need time. But the other thing that you got to look at is, are you really solving a problem in a market that's big enough to hit these two metrics on the top? So if you're in a market, or if your product is serving something, or it's serving a need, where you may not be able to hit those numbers. You might be maybe able to get to $50 million in annual revenue, but perhaps the market's not that big enough, so it's really hard for you to grow 3x a year at that scale. So an outside investor will look at that, and even if you're making $50 million a year, it infers, because you're not growing 3 times a year, it infers to me as an investor that the market may not be big enough for you to become a sustainable sort of unicorn afterwards. And your consumer product may not be able to meet the needs or the demands or the satisfaction of hundreds of millions of people in the world in order for you to become a multi-billion-dollar consumer product within the market that we're in today. So just keep all this in mind, because the reason investors would mint a unicorn, I'm talking about venture capitalists. So when a venture capital firm invests into a company at $1 billion, you have to understand that the investor who is investing in that round is making a bet that your company could be a 10 billion plus type of a company one day. So that's why growth at scale is important, and that's why it doesn't matter how much money you're making today or how many users you have today, that growth rate implies how big the market is remaining to be captured. And that growth rate is what ultimately implies to the investor that it can be a $10 billion type of an outcome. And once an investor has that conviction, that's when that founder is able to get that $1 billion valuation. So just keep all these things in mind, because I think a lot of founders tend to forget how long it takes, what actually needs to be done, and how simple it really is to value what a company may have to look like to be a unicorn based on the usage numbers and the revenue numbers here. So the other stat I want to sort of share with you, we talked about 1,100 unicorns in the world. about 20% of that come from what I will call quote-unquote small countries, right? Home countries under 100 million population. That would include here, South Korea, but also includes things like the UK, Israel, Germany, Canada, Singapore, Australia, Ireland. These small countries, quote-unquote small countries, can indeed produce their own unicorns. And we'll talk about Korea in a little bit, but I want to dive into this small home country format because I think a lot of Koreans look at the Korean domestic market as a small market. So there's very unique plays that you have to play within a small home market to become a global unicorn. So that's what we are going to be touching on in the following slides. So if you are based in a small home country market, regional or global, is always going to be bigger than the home markets that you're in. So what I want to say by this, we talked about previously that there's 20% of the world's unicorns, so about 200 of the world's unicorns are based in the non-Chinas, the non-Indias, the non-Japans, and the non-Indonesias, so the smaller, less than 100 million population unicorns. But 5% of the world's unicorns, so not 20, so about a quarter of those unicorns that are based outside of the large countries, they are from small home countries who are targeting their small home country market primarily. So an example here, it means like, Korean companies that are in e-commerce or gaming or fintech or social. Those types of companies are, Kakao, for example, is a company, it's not a startup, but they're primarily focused here in Korea. Toss is a great example of a company that's only purely focused here in Korea. 배달민족 is also another great example. So there are very, very, very few unicorns in the world that are targeting their small home countries and able to become unicorns. Because most of the global unicorns outside of the US and only founded in these small home country target regions, they target globally or regional markets. So I just put up 4 of our most common markets that we invest at 500. Vast majority of our non-Indonesian Southeast Asian unicorns do not target just Singapore or just Malaysia or just Philippines. From day one, they're targeting that entire region. Vast majority of our European-based unicorns also do not just serve only their market. They're targeting the entire European Union. UK, Germany, France, whatever you name it, you're out there. Internet's global, right? Vast majority, even African companies, certainly do not target only their own countries that they serve. They would target maybe the regions of West Africa, East Africa, South Africa. But the reason that they're sort of thinking about this is every single one of these countries in itself is not big enough to sustain a unicorn, but the region may. And the last point is vast majority of non-Mexico and non-Brazil, because those are the 2 countries within Latin America that are over that 100 million mark, so you can make the argument that these are large domestic markets. But outside of Mexico and Brazil, the Chilean companies, the Colombian companies, the Argentinian companies, all these types of companies are all targeting the entire Latin America sector, the region as well. Thus, their market that they're serving becomes much, much more populous than their domestic home country's population. So that's a point that I just want to make and leave in your heads, because we're going to be talking about South Korea. South Korea has been the only exception in the world where vast majority of its unicorns target the domestic market only. So if you look at the primary only Korean market targeters that are unicorns and still private, you got 야놀자, 두나무, 토스 당근, 컬리, 쿠팡, 위마프, 무신사, 오늘집, 리디, 직방, 소카, and many more that you guys can probably think about. Really, the only regional/global targeting companies that are unicorns are Bspin Global, which is a service provider for cloud. You have Senbird, which is an actual software product company, and then you have Krafton, which is a gaming company. So the ratio of South Korean unicorns who target domestic markets versus regional or global markets is the absolute opposite of any other region that we invest in the world. Now, that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I'm not also saying that it's not a bad thing either. It's just something that's unique for Korea. So let's sort of talk about this. There's obviously going to continue to be more Korean unicorns targeting the domestic market. We at 500 believe there's several markets within Korea that can sustain and produce several unicorns for just the domestic market. But the question is, and for this session, how do we build more Korean-based global unicorns? So this is sort of what I want to talk to you folks today about, and this is the highlight of sort of the presentation today. So really it's just 5 things, and we'll dive into this one by one, but how do you build a global unicorn from South Korea? So number 1, make sure you're addressing a global or regional need from the start. Number 2, if you have that, then you have to make sure that your founding team is capable of operating and hiring the best talent globally. Just as one of the feedbacks that I'll provide, some of the founders that may be in the room who are interested in, let's say, just US as an example. I'm not saying US is the only market that's global, but if you want to target the US, unless you're prepared to be able to hire and recruit the best of the best talent in those markets, you have no shot. Because there's going to be 1,000 other companies who are able to hire the best of the best in those regions. They might not beat you in Korea, but that's not what you're trying to do. So this number 2 point is very important, is that you have to have a founding team that's able to recruit and hire and operate with the best talent globally in the markets you want to serve in. Number 3 is more about sort of culture of the team and operations, which is, can you build and operate with talent on a global standard level? The way Korean companies work in Korean offices is vastly different than how a San Francisco-based company works with their San Francisco staff. A lot of Korean-based founders may not realize how different that is. But these are the subtle nuances within corporate culture that you have to understand how to operate in so that, going back to the number 2 point, you can retain and hire the best talent globally. Number 4, I think it's also very, very important to be able to, as a founder, if you have the opportunity to do so, work with investors who have worked with global unicorns. Building a global unicorn is hard in itself for the founders. You don't want to be working with an investor who's never, 1, been part of a unicorn, or 2, only know how a unicorn is created in their domestic markets, but they may not be aware about what it takes to be global. And number 5 is just a mental thing. For founders who are thinking about building a company that hopefully can become one of those rare, truly rare unicorns here in Korea that's going to be based in Korea, but targeting a global market and becoming a unicorn, you as founders have to believe that from day 1, you are a global startup. You're not a Korean startup anymore. You have to get that identity out of your head. So let's dive into every single one of these steps sort of one by one, and I'll talk through it a little bit more to get a little bit more color and context. So number 1 on addressing a global need. Question here is, what are the problems, the pains, the issues that enough people or enough businesses in the world or regions are facing today that will require, or that whether it's you or someone else, you know there's going to be a solution for this that's widely accepted by that populace within the next 5 to 10 years. So the litmus test that I like to have with a lot of founders who are just starting out and ideating what they want to work on, it's not a check mark, but I'm just giving you examples of maybe 3 simple questions. For consumer product, can you see this product changing the lives of 100 million people in the world? For better or for worse, whatever it is, will 100 million people in the world be using what you've built? If it's not a consumer product, you don't have to ask that question. The second one is the problem large enough for the winner in the market to be able to produce $1 billion in annual revenues 10 years from now? This part's very, very important because the market sometimes may be big. I'll give you an example, like the food market, right? Everyone eats twice, 3 times a day. The market's massive, but the goal if you're doing a food tech startup is not to capture 1% of this gigantic market that's global, right? Because you can't. That's not how it works. So the question here is you want to make sure you're targeting a market that's not only just big enough where the winner can comfortably create $1 billion in revenue on an annualized basis, and that would assume that's a $10 billion plus company, but that there in fact is a winner. And what I mean by this is that there needs to be network effects or whatever to create what we call at least a minimum oligopoly type of a market, where there's maybe 3 winners, or 2 winners take 80% of the market, with the number 1 winner taking 60% of the market. Those are the types of markets that are going to produce unicorns over and over and over again. And you have to make sure that that market you're serving not only produces a clear winner, a market winner, but that the market is big enough for you to do $1 billion sometime in the future, right? And 10 years is just an arbitrary mark. There are very few companies in the world that actually get to $1 billion in revenue in 10 years. But just think about that as like a long-term thing. Do I believe this market's big enough for this revenue target to be potential one day? Now, on the third point, I kind of talked about a little bit, which is the network effects. So the network effects, how I think about it, is does your success allow you to be more successful over time? Meaning, you becoming more successful becomes easier over time because of your network effects that you've built in. Network effects, a loose version of this, or a very weak version of a network effect, might be your brand power. Because more people recognize you, so more people are willing to work with you versus another competitor. That's a very, very weak format of network effect. Most investors don't consider that network effect, and we don't either, but just to give you an example. Now, a strong example is telephones. When I have my own telephone, and I'm the only person in the world, I have no value for that telephone. If my wife now has a telephone, great. It's value for just one-to-one conversations. And now when all of us ends up having the same telephones, guess what? The value that each one of us as consumers feel is now much better. And that's an example of a network effect that's derived on the user side. So this is an example of a network effect in which the value perceived by the users of your customers, basically, are feeling more value in getting your product out because you're getting bigger. There's other examples of where network effects are applied to your business operations. And we call this a flywheel. So strategic flywheels, where a company's success allows them to be able to bring on more partnerships. More partnerships may represent or provide more options for their customers, and more customers are bringing in more partnerships. So whatever these network effects are, and obviously the easiest thing to know too is the social networks too, right? Social network companies are probably a good example of value perceived by the end user as well as the business in itself. But network effects are incredibly, incredibly important, because if you're in a large enough market, and if you're fortunate as founders to be in a large enough market, you must have network effects in order for you to have a chance to become a winner. In large markets where there are no network effects in play, everyone's going to be about a 1% or 2% ownership of the market share. That is usually never going to be big enough to produce a unicorn in software. So now the second point around your founding team that we talked about in those, six points that I shared earlier. I think this is something that we feel very strongly about at 500, having worked with Korean companies now. We started investing in our first Korean companies back in 2014. But really, it's just fundamental for us, which is, number one, is your founding team fluent and well-connected in the primary markets you want to serve? So if you are a Korean founder and you're saying that you want to go out to the US, are you fluent in English? And are you so well-connected within the US? Now, the well-connected part may not really that matter, because maybe a helpful investor can help you sort of put together a team that's high caliber in the beginning, but it's really about you have to be fluent. You really do. And if the CEO and the founders are not fluent, I don't care who else is fluent on the team, because the founder and CEO is going to be the one that needs to share their vision with the investors, with their next C-level hires, as they sort of open up to the rest of the market and the markets that you're targeting. I give an example to this to a lot of my friends and founders here in Korea, which is I think a lot of founders in Korea, when they think about going to the US to start companies, they just feel like it's almost like a you must do it kind of thing. You must figure it out. But I want to give you a different example, because it'd be the equivalent of you asking me to start a company in Brazil. I don't speak Portuguese. I've never spent long time in Brazil. I don't know anyone there. Whatever item or product I'm building is vastly going to have a lower probability of success than me building in the markets that I'm comfortable with. So if you are a Korean company and you want to go global markets, do not kid yourself on the importance of making sure your founding team is versed, fluent, and connected in the markets that you're targeting. Number two, that connection part's important because, and that fluency is important because it really leads to, are you able to hire the best talent in the markets that you serve? And I think this piece is so fundamentally missed a lot by a lot of Korean founders who come out to the US to start companies. Because if you're limited to speaking Korean, you're limited to hiring people who only speak Korean or who can speak Korean in the States. Your talent pool has already dropped by maybe 5%. Probably dropped by 95%. So if there's 1,000 people you could hire, maybe you're left with 50. And I would guarantee you the most talented person that you could have hired for is likely not part of that remaining 50 anymore. So you do have to make sure that you're, again, versed, connected, fluent, and comfortable in the markets that you're in order for you to give yourself a shot at doing so. So these are very simple questions, but it's a very, very clear answer to, I think, what's needed at the founding team level for you to have a shot at becoming a global unicorn. Even if you have this, does not mean that you're guaranteed to be a global unicorn, obviously. But I guarantee you one thing, if you don't have this, you have 0% chance. Moving over to 3, it's really about operating with talent on a global standard. So it's sort of similar to that second point that I'm sort of leaving off on. 4 points. So are you not able to just hire but retain the best talents in the markets that you're familiar with? Are you familiar with the work culture there? We talked about this a little bit. Are you also able to compete for customers in the markets that you're targeting? Do you know what the best practices are to target customers and customer acquisition channels and strategies in the markets that you're targeting? Because the way that you're acquiring customers here at home in Korea is going to be vastly, vastly different than what you need to do to acquire customers in the US, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, Middle East, wherever you're trying to go. Number 3, are you able to compensate both at the equity level as well as cash at the standard of the markets that you want to target? So just to give you an example, here in Korea, mid-level engineers 5 years in at a growing startup, they're probably making around 8천만 won to 1억 won in terms of salary. And their equity numbers aren't that life-changing for them. In the States, interns are making $180,000. More than 1억 won, right? And also, if you're trying to set up shop in San Francisco and you're also trying to hire the best, you do have to play the ball in the game the way that it's played. So you have to make sure that you understand what equity compensation looks like for the roles that you're trying to hire. And more importantly, as a startup, that means that you have to be able to afford it. So just think through that from a compensation standpoint. I think it's very, very important because what usually ends up happening is you have founders who go out to Korea, and because they're not that fluent in English, they end up hiring people who speak Korean, who are maybe Korean Americans or whatever. And then they also don't have the funds to give them the talent, the compensation that they deserve or are able to get elsewhere. So then you're just left with people that are comfortable making much less than what the markets are doing, and you're limiting yourself to only hiring people that speak Korean. I would guarantee you those people that you've hired is not top-tier talent. And you're asking them, the not top-tier talent, to now compete in Silicon Valley against the best in the world. So you do have to be very, very real about what it takes to have a shot at becoming a unicorn. And this is a very, very important piece, your ability to retain and hire the best and be able to compensate them. Number 4, and this is something that the world went through during COVID, right? Which is, are you able to sort of create a high-functioning environment between your multiple different locations and regions? Maybe you have offices in Korea, maybe you have offices in Indonesia, maybe you have another office in India. But you can't treat these as 3 separate companies. Otherwise, there's no, the sum of everything that's happening is less than the parts that you're operating as a startup. You have to make sure that you create a sense of operational efficiency which you're in a business, that you feel like even though you may be separated, the company itself runs as one, whether it's a US office, European office, or whatever. And it's hard. You might have an engineering team here in Korea, a product team in the US, and a sales team in Europe. You do have to make sure the team is obsessed about creating operational efficiencies or on making sure that the team fits and works well together. If you do, you have an incredible advantage, competitive advantage against the rest of the companies in the world, because this is a really hard point to figure out. But guess what? US companies don't have to figure it out because they're based in the US. And by being a US company, being global is sort of unfair advantage. But for Korean companies, yes, it's unlucky that Korean companies, because of the language, the culture, the location, doesn't mean that we can do the same things that we do here in Korea and expect that to happen in Southeast Asia or the US. But because we now have to go out of Korea to set up shop elsewhere, if you figure out this number 4, it actually becomes a superpower that puts you at an operational advantage than other companies that never have to have remote locations, which means you might be able to hire the best of the talent globally. Not just San Francisco, not just Palo Alto, not just New York, not just Paris, wherever you're trying to hire. So take that number 4 as a sense of challenge. I think if you figure it out, it becomes a superpower that really, really aids in operation efficiency of your business. Next point, on the global investor point, I think building a company in itself, so I was a former founder before, my startup got funded by 500 Global, where I'm now as a managing partner. So my journey started out as a founder, and building a company is challenging, right? And trying to build a global unicorn from South Korea is even more challenging. If one of you becomes a global market-facing unicorn and you're based in Korea, you yourself are a unicorn because it's so rare to find talent like you. But are you surrounded now by helpful, supportive investors who know what it takes to build global unicorns? Number 2, the US investors, just as an example, who only work with US companies are not going to be helpful for South Korean companies. And South Korean investors who only work with South Korean market companies are not going to be helpful for you based in South Korea trying to go for the global markets. Just be very real about making sure your investors know what they're doing. And the other thing that I'll say too, most investors, if you go to their websites, they'll showcase their portfolio. Do your diligence. I ask this to founders all the time. Pick out 5 companies that you recognize from the portfolio, and then reach out to the founders, see what they say about the investors that they've worked with. What's telling is if there's not 5 companies that you recognize from their portfolio, 1, that's probably bad. Probably shouldn't be working with them. Number 2, if they're unable to give, or you're not able to hear extremely positive reviews on an investor when you're doing diligence checks, that's a yellow flag too. The best investors will always get the biggest references and fans from founders that they work with. So you have to target that. You do have to find it. So really, it's just 4, right? Because you have to have all of these 3 things, because otherwise you're finding investors who are going to be cheerleaders. You don't need cheerleaders to be a global unicorn. You need people that are going to be actually adding value to help you become a global unicorn based out of South Korea. And then that lastly on the mindset point, before we move over to Q&A, just as an example, Southeast Asian companies within our portfolio who have now become unicorns like Grab, Bukalapak, Carousel, we have about 8 unicorns in Southeast Asia. All of them started out from day 1 with the intention from the start to open and target multiple different countries within that region. So the difference for Korea is I think founders start out obviously originally planning to target the Korean market. And then they say things like, let me just get established and succeed here in Korea, and then by Series B, we'll start launching out elsewhere. That's never going to happen. The culture of your business is already that of a Korean company. It's going to be extremely hard for you to be able to bring in global market leaders who think about the importance of that, especially when you spent the first 5 years of the company not focused on the outside of the Korean market once at all. So you really do have to, you're serving a global audience from day 1 if you're working on those right problems. The last point I want to mention here is you're not a Korean startup. You are now a global startup, and you're competing with the best of the best from Silicon Valley, from Europe, Singapore, China, beyond. you have to make sure your team is up for that because the competition is vastly different. I think that's the last slide. So I'll end it here and open up for Q&As. Thank you guys so much, and hopefully one of you guys becomes a global unicorn. Looking forward to answering some questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Next session is the Q&A session. Well, we have some questions about it. The first question it is, many global companies like Airbnb are difficult to go through Korean market because of Korean regional companies. And how can global companies go through Korean market, do you think?
It's a great question. I think that probably maybe applies to a very small percentage of people in this audience today. But so it is true that Korea tends to be what's described as a very protectionist regulatory country. So examples of Ubers, the Airbnbs, even Google with Google Maps. It is difficult, but I think the easiest thing that Uber learned when they came out here was that you just have to be able to be friendly and work with the regulators very closely from day one. And so that's a different part. Western countries are not used to dealing with governments in business. But the moment you start coming to Korea or East Asian countries or South Asian countries, you do have to keep the government in mind. And here in Korea, it's not necessarily China in the sense that you don't necessarily need quote-unquote approval or be on everyone's good side. But I think the Korean government, for some of even our portfolio companies that are based in Europe that's trying to launch here, it's just helpful and friendly to make sure you keep everyone at bay, make sure that they understand what you're trying to do. And then everything else, it's going to be the same. So that's what I'll sort of leave with on that point.
Thank you very much. Your answer. 제 생각에는요, 지금 저희 청중석에서 더 질문이 있으실 것 같습니다. 혹시 미처 질문을 하지 못하신 분께서는요, 손을 들어주시면 지금 바로 저희 마이크를 전달 드리도록 하겠습니다. 질문 있으십니까? 네, 마이크 전달 드리겠습니다.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for the nice presentation. And actually, I'm a CEO from the new startup. And if I pass all litmus test and I fit into the rice market, is it possible to send a IR presentation to you?
Sure. Yeah, we have a team here in Korea, so I'll send you their contact information. You can send it over to.
Thank you so much.
네, 감사합니다. 혹시 또 질문 있으신 분 계시면요, 질문을 받도록 하겠습니다. 네, 이렇게 저희 미국에서 글로벌 유니콘으로 성장할 수 있는 사례를 저희 한국에 오셔서 이렇게 공유해 주신 우리 500 글로벌 팀 체님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. Thank you very much once again.